All right, so imagine this. You're sitting down January 20th, 2025, inauguration day.
Big day.
Right, huge day, of course, but instead of all the usual, the pomp and the circumstance, right?
Yeah.
What's dominating the headlines is a wave of pardons all connected to January 6th,
Oh, wow.
the Capitol riot. That's the big story right out of the gate.
Hmm.
And we're not talking just a few, we're talking a huge, rapid series of actions,
Immediately.
right away as this new term begins. So that's what we're going to deep dive into today.
Right.
We're going to really explore what Donald Trump did right after he returned to the presidency in January 2025. We're going to zero in on these mass pardons, the massive personnel changes across a bunch of federal agencies, places like Department of Justice, the Pentagon, Health and Human Services, USA, the EPA, IRS, the VA, you name it.
Big departments.
Big stuff, right? And then how did the political world react to all of this, in the months that followed up to April 2025?
So we're talking to the first few months of his term.
Exactly, the first few months. And to kind of guide us, we've got this really interesting YouTube transcript. It's kind of laying out a narrative of these intense early months.
Okay.
So what we're trying to do is understand, what was the scope of these actions? What were the reasons given for them? And what were the immediate responses that we saw from different parts of society and across the political spectrum? So it's not just about what he did, but like what happened when he did it.
Right. It's understanding the why and the reactions to the what, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just describing what happened. It's understanding the motivations and the fallout.
That's it. That's it. So let's jump right in. Let's start unpacking this first big move, and that was this sweeping pardon that was reportedly signed on January 20th, 2025 itself.
Wow, so day one.
Day one. And it affected a ton of people involved in the January 6th events. Our source kind of refers to it as the kerfuffle.
Kerfuffle, yeah.
But the scale here is important to note. I mean, the report suggests something like 1,500 individuals received these pardons.
Wow.
That's a big number.
Yeah, 1,500 right off the bat. I mean, that really does signal a clear priority.
Right, it does. And the justification that was given by Trump, according to the transcript, was all about putting an end to a grave national injustice and beginning this process of national healing. So I think it's interesting, those two ideas, addressing an injustice and promoting healing, they're presented together. What do you think is the connection there?
Well, I think that framing, right, is a very powerful rhetorical tool.
Yeah.
When you talk about national injustice, it really appeals to his sense of victimhood.
Right.
Among his supporters who really believe that those people involved in January 6th were unfairly targeted. And then at the same time, when you pair that with national healing, it suggests that there's a desire for unity, but it's arguably on his terms, right? Okay. So it allows him to do two things at once: energize his base by fulfilling a promise, but also project an image of moving forward, even amidst what were very clearly some very, very deep divisions.
Yeah. And it's not like this came out of nowhere, right? The transcript mentions that Trump had actually been previewing these actions. Back at his victory rally, he was already calling these people J6 hostages and patriots. I mean, that kind of language really set the stage for these pardons. It wasn't a surprise.
No, not at all.
Right.
By using those terms consistently, hostages and patriots, he was shaping the narrative well in advance.
Right.
So by the time these pardons were actually issued, they were seen as a fulfillment of a promise rather than, some sudden or unexpected decision.
Yeah, it was almost expected at that point by a certain portion of the population.
Exactly.
Now, beyond these broad pardons, there are some specific people that our source points out. Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes, leaders of these right-wing groups, had their sentences reduced.
Right.
And it's important to remember these weren't full pardons, just, reductions in how much time they had to serve.
Right, so their convictions still stand.
Exactly.
The legal findings are not overturned. However, the amount of time they have to spend in prison is lessened.
Right, so it's kind of a middle ground.
It is. It's a very nuanced approach that allows him to show support for these individuals and potentially energize their followers, but without fully absolving them of the responsibility.
Okay, so it's not a full pardon, which would maybe draw even more criticism, but it's also not doing nothing at all. It's somewhere in between.
It's a very calculated move.
So as you can imagine, the reactions to these pardons were split. Yeah. I mean, some people saw these as decisive leadership, keeping promises that were made.
Right.
But others, especially on the left, saw them as incredibly divisive and a real slap in the face to the legal system.
That division really gets to the heart of the issue.
Yeah.
For supporters, these pardons reinforced the idea that the justice system was weaponized against people with certain political views.
Interesting.
The pardons would be seen as correcting that imbalance.
Right.
But for critics, it raised serious questions about the rule of law, about the independence of the judicial system, and the idea of accountability.
Yeah, and our source even mentions that some of the pardons were reportedly granted to individuals who tangled with the Capitol cops. That detail adds another layer of controversy to this whole thing, doesn't it?
For sure. I mean, pardoning individuals who are directly involved in violence with law enforcement is going to be controversial no matter what. It touches on those fundamental ideas of law and order and the protection of the people who are supposed to be upholding it.
Right, and it goes beyond, this idea that the legal process was unfair.
Right.
It's making a statement about what happened on January 6th and who's to blame.
Yeah, it really solidifies this perspective that these pardons weren't just about, perceived legal unfairness, but they reflected a very specific point of view.
All right, so we've got a picture of what happened with these pardons. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the second major area: the reported widespread firings and personnel changes within the federal government.
Yeah, this is a big one.
It's huge, and it reportedly started right away on Trump's first day back. Yeah, and then it continued in the weeks and months that followed up to April 2025.
Yeah.
So we're talking a major shakeup across all kinds of different agencies.
It sounds like a very, very deliberate effort to reshape the federal government.
Right. And they started with these high-profile figures right on January 20th. People like General Mark Milley, Brian Hook, Keisha Lance Bottoms, Jose Andres. I mean, it sent a really clear message.
Yeah, I mean, when you start removing individuals of that stature right off the bat,
yeah,
it signals a very clear shift in direction.
Right, a shift in who's in charge and what they're going to do.
Exactly.
But it wasn't just those top-level folks, right?
Right.
The transcript also mentions a broader push within the personnel office to remove over 1,000 people who had been appointed during the Biden administration all across the board.
Wow, so this is a systematic effort.
Yeah, this was not random. This was coordinated.
To replace individuals who were perceived as loyal to the previous administration with people who aligned with the new president's agenda.
So it's a huge personnel change. And what kind of impact do you think that has on how these agencies actually work?
Well, it can be really profound.
Yeah.
I mean, you have potential shifts in how policies are implemented. There's potential loss of institutional knowledge.
Right, if the people who know how things work are gone.
Exactly.
So let's get into some specifics here. The Department of Justice reportedly saw all of the Biden-appointed U.S. attorneys fired on February 18th, 2025.
Wow.
And then on top of that, they reportedly also cleared out some career prosecutors, including one guy named Adam Schleifer, who had apparently posted some anti-Trump tweets in the past.
Okay.
And the reason they gave was to make sure that the president's agenda would be faithfully executed. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think what's really notable here is the direct link that's being made between personnel decisions and executing the president's agenda within the Justice Department. And while it's not unusual for a new president to appoint their own U.S. attorneys, the reported dismissal of career prosecutors based on their past political views raises some questions.
Yeah, does this mean that law enforcement is being politicized?
Right, exactly. And this stated reason of making sure the president's agenda is executed suggests that there's a very strong emphasis on loyalty throughout the department.
Okay, so loyalty to the president.
Yeah.
We also saw some big changes at the Pentagon in February 2025. Some really top military leaders, General C.Q. Brown Jr., Admiral Lisa Franchetti, General Jim Slife, and even some military judges were reportedly dismissed.
Oh, wow.
And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth reportedly supported these moves, saying that it was important to have a team that was completely on board with the president's vision for the military. So how do you think these changes might impact the military's traditional apolitical stance?
That's a really interesting question, because the military has this long-standing tradition of being nonpartisan and apolitical.
Right.
But when you see the dismissal of such high-ranking officers, and the stated reason is aligning with the president's vision, it raises questions about whether political considerations are now influencing military decisions.
Right, and could that then affect the military's independence?
Potentially, and its role in national security as well.
Yeah, and it wasn't just these top-level positions that were cut. Our source goes on to detail these reported job reductions across a bunch of federal agencies: HHS, USID, the EPA, the DoD more broadly, the USDA, the FAA, the IRS, the VA. I mean, it seems like a huge effort was underway to shrink the federal workforce.
It does seem that way, and I think there could be a few reasons for that.
Yeah, what do you think might be motivating these widespread cuts?
Well, one reason could be a desire to cut spending and reduce the national debt.
Okay, that's certainly something that that comes up a lot.
Right. Another could be a more ideological belief in smaller government.
Right. Get the government out of things.
Exactly. Or it could be a more strategic move to remove people who are seen as not supportive of the administration's policies.
Yeah, so get rid of the people who aren't with you and bring in the people who are.
Right. It could be any combination of those things.
The transcript even gives us some specific examples. For instance, there were reports of 10,000 HHS employees being dismissed, and Bobby Kennedy Jr. was reportedly involved somehow.
Oh, wow.
And then over at USAID, over 1,000 employees were reportedly put on administrative leave, which paused some humanitarian programs. And then in some other agencies, they seem to be focusing on getting rid of probationary hires.
So those specific examples really show us the scale and the impact of these changes, right?
They do. They really bring it to life. And you can see how this would actually affect things on the ground.
Absolutely.
And here's a detail I found really interesting. The transcript mentions Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency DOGE reportedly playing a role in justifying some of these federal job cuts. So that's pretty unusual, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not your typical process to have someone from the private sector weighing in on these decisions.
Right. Elon Musk, this guy who's, all about efficiency and sometimes, kind of shaking things up.
Right.
And he's involved in justifying these cuts.
Yeah, it's very unconventional.
So what do you think that means?
Well, it could be a sign of things to come, right?
Yeah.
This trend of using private sector models and ways of thinking to evaluate government jobs.
So are government jobs going to be judged by private sector standards?
Potentially.
Yeah.
And some people might see that as innovative, a way to streamline things.
Yeah.
But others might see it as the private sector having too much influence on public service.
Right. So you've got these two very different ways of looking at it.
And I think the DOGE part of it just adds another layer of strangeness to the whole thing.
So unsurprisingly, right, people who supported the president probably saw all these firings and personnel changes as a good thing.
Yeah, they likely saw it as necessary to finally get his agenda implemented.
Right.
To make the government more efficient.
Get rid of the bloat.
Exactly, because they often see the federal bureaucracy as this bloated, inefficient thing.
Yeah. But on the other hand, critics had some real concerns.
Rightfully so.
They were worried about losing valuable expertise within these agencies,
Right.
What happens when the people who know how to do things are gone?
Exactly.
They were also worried about political payback motivating these decisions. And the big question is, what does all this mean for the stability and effectiveness of the government services that we all rely on?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to think about the potential consequences.
Right.
When you have this mass exodus of experienced people,
Yeah.
it can disrupt how agencies function, lead to a loss of institutional knowledge, and ultimately compromise the quality of the services that they provide.
Yeah, and if people believe that these decisions were driven by politics, it could make government workers afraid to speak up or do their jobs properly.
Absolutely. It could really undermine the idea of a nonpartisan and professional public service.
Okay, so we've talked about the pardons and the firings now. Let's move on to how people reacted to all of this as of April 2025, according to our source.
Right. How did the public and the political world respond to these events?
And it's probably no surprise that the nation was pretty divided.
Yeah, I mean, given the nature of these actions, it's not surprising at all to see that kind of division.
Right, the transcript shows us a pretty polarized public opinion.
Right.
People who supported Trump generally had a positive view of these actions.
Right. They saw it as him keeping his promises and correcting what they saw as injustices.
Right. But others, especially when it came to the pardons, for those involved in the violence on January 6th, had very negative reactions.
Yeah, that was a particularly contentious issue.
It was. And interestingly, the report mentions that even some Republicans had reservations about certain things.
Interesting. So even within the party, there was some unease.
Yeah, particularly about those pardons for people involved in January 6th.
Right. So it suggests that while there was a base of support for the president's agenda, January 6th remained this point of friction even within his own party.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? I mean, you've got this desire for party unity, but at the same time, this specific issue of the January 6th pardons, it really touched a nerve for some people.
Yeah, it raised those deeper questions about accountability for that day and the rule of law.
Exactly. Now, the transcript also mentions the reactions of the families and supporters of those who were pardoned for January 6th, and they were understandably pretty happy about it.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all.
It fits right in with the J6 hostages and patriots rhetoric.
Absolutely. For them, this was a vindication, relief.
Yeah.
They saw the president as standing by them and those they believed were wrongly accused by the justice system.
So a lot of emotion tied up in that, for sure. Politically, the reactions seem to be pretty predictable. Democrats reportedly strongly condemned both the pardons and the firings. They saw it as an abuse of presidential power and a threat to the rule of law and the independence of federal agencies.
Yeah, that aligns with their broader concerns about executive overreach.
Right, and protecting democratic norms and institutions.
Exactly. The pardons were seen as undermining the justice system and accountability, and the firings were seen as a politically driven purge of the civil service.
Right, so how did the Republicans react besides those reservations about the pardons?
Well, the transcript says the overall Republican response was mostly supportive.
Okay.
They focused on the president's right to choose his own team.
Mm-hmm.
And the report even mentions that then Vice President G.D. Vance had made comments in the past that didn't really line up with these pardons.
Interesting.
But he still continued to support President Trump.
So walking a bit of a tightrope there.
It does highlight how complicated politics can be.
Yeah.
There might be disagreements, but the need for party unity and supporting the leader often outweighs those concerns publicly.
And the argument that the president has the right to choose his own team is a classic one, right?
It's very common and very effective in these situations to justify personnel changes.
Now, one thing that was interesting was that the transcript mentions a bipartisan concern in the House of Representatives. There was this letter that expressed worry about the firing of those high-ranking military officials, and they requested that clear, non-political rules be put in place for these actions in the future.
So that's interesting that there was some agreement across party lines on this.
Yeah, it seems like both sides were a little bit uncomfortable with how that played out.
I think it shows the special place that the military holds in American society.
Right.
There's this shared desire to make sure that it stays apolitical.
Yeah, so they want rules to prevent these decisions from being seen as political and possibly hurting national security.
Exactly.
So taking a step back, looking at the big picture that our source paints for us as of April 2025, it really looks like a deeply divided nation grappling with these actions that President Trump took when he came back into office.
Absolutely. The pardons and the personnel changes really just poured fuel on the fire of existing political and social divisions.
Right. And it seems like there were very strong and very opposing views on whether these actions were justified and what they might mean for the future.
Were they decisive leadership or politically motivated overreach? That was the question everyone was wrestling with.
Exactly. So to wrap up our deep dive, let's just go over the key things we talked about today. First, those mass pardons for those involved in the January 6th Capitol riot, and then all the firings and personnel changes that happened across tons of federal agencies in those first few months of Trump's 2025 term.
Yeah, it was a whirlwind.
It really was. And what's so fascinating is how differently people viewed these moves.
Right. You had some who saw them as fixing injustices and making the government more efficient.
Yeah, decisive leadership, right.
Right. But others saw them as a power grab that could hurt the justice system, national security, and even basic government services.
So it's this really stark contrast in interpretation. And that brings us to our final thought for you all today. Given the scale and the speed of these actions and the fact that they created such strong reactions across the political spectrum, what do you think this all means for the future of American governance and the balance of power in our system? We encourage you to think about all the different perspectives we've explored today and to keep considering how these events might play out in the long run. As of April 2025, this story was definitely not over, and its full impact remains to be seen.
That's for sure.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
See you next time.
See you next time.